Welcome, welcome. Come on in. We are going to wait a minute for folks to all get into the Zoom room. And while we're doing that, I would love for you to put in the chat who you are. If you're representing an organization, let us know that. Where are you zooming in from? And what are you hoping to learn tonight? What made you show up tonight? There are a million things you could be doing. We're so glad you're here. We'd love to make sure that we answer all the stuff that you're looking for tonight. So just introduce yourselves in the chat so we can get to know who's in the room. We'll be getting started in just a minute. Folks are still coming in. Welcome, welcome. We're just getting started, and folks are going to be introducing themselves in the chat so that we all can get a sense of who's in the room together. Build that sense of community. We're just going to give it 30 more seconds. And then we're going to jump in because also we value your time and we promise to finish on time. Always want to know what's going on. Yeah, great. Thanks for being here, Susanna. Hi, Troy from North Carolina. Josh Daniels. Yes on Three campaign. I worked on that, Josh. That's Rebecca and I worked on that together, actually.
We sure did.
Excellent. Virginia Ledge. Great. Jay joining from amazing. Vancouver. Lake George. And hi, Amy. Love it, love it, love it. Gosh, folks from all over. Loving to see it.
Love some indivisible
Yes, we
representation.
love Indivisible. Hi to your cat. That's very important. Rebecca's cats, I assume, are also here. Hello. Is that Meep or Moop? I
So
don't.
the Jonesy, my girlfriend's cat, is sleeping on
Oh,
the desk.
that's
Meep and Moop
Jonesy.
are hiding in the closet because there is a contractor in my condo and
Oh.
they're having some big feelings about it.
Learn Mobo NYC. This is so cool. Well, it's great to see everyone. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Jacqueline Friedman, and I am the founder and executive director of Educate Us. Educate Us is an organization dedicated to building an unstoppable people-powered movement for sex education around the country. Yes, the Pearl Eagles. I love that. And these monthly No Means No sessions are part of our work. So we have these once a month, and it's always on a topic that's going to help you be a better advocate or organizer for sex education in whatever context you work in. So we're so excited to have you here. And also to have Rebecca Kling here, who's one of my faves, I'll be honest. um, just in a generalized sense, and on the topic of how we best advocate for trans rights. We're talking tonight about the latest and greatest from this incredible research project called TONS, the Trans Organizing and Narrative. What was the S for?
Shift.
Shift, yes, shift. Um, and Rebecca was deeply involved in that research and is going to read us in on what the latest and greatest is on how we can make the best impact for trans rights in this country. Um, she's going to introduce herself and give you a little overview via slides. Then we're going to also, she and I are going to talk a bit, and then we're going to take your questions. So use the Q&A to put your questions in as you go. You don't have to wait till the end. The one thing I will say before Rebecca takes it away with the slides is this event, these No Means No events are always free to attend, but they are not free to produce. And so if you can, and if you appreciate that we're having this and you can make a donation to educate us so we can keep doing this, AJ, our program assistant, is going to put that link in the chat, and we appreciate literally anything. You can do $5, $10, it all adds up. So without further ado, let's get into it, Rebecca. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. I am Rebecca Kling. I use she, her pronouns, and I am with Better World Collaborative. We provide strategic communications and public relations services, advocacy training, campaign development, and storytelling strategies for shifting culture and public opinion. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois. And a little bit about myself, I am trans myself and got into this work through theater and performance. So I was a theater kid, and through telling my own story on stage, learned the power of storytelling, and that helping other people tell their own stories for advocacy and for cultural shift is both really rewarding and incredibly effective. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. A couple other things. I am on the Harbor Camps board of directors. Harbor Camps is a camp for gender variant and trans young people. I serve alongside Jacqueline on the Our Bodies, Ourselves Leadership Council. I'm the co-author of, let's see if I can do it, the Advocate Educator's Handbook, which is about supporting trans youth in schools. And I have a piece included in the Lambda Literary Award-winning Too Trans, Too Furious, an extremely serious study of transgender street racing. So lots of good things there. And this is a project of the Equality Federation Institute with both my organization, Better World Collaborative, as well as Goodwin Simon Strategic Research and the New Conversation Initiative. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them as well. Content warning. We're going to be discussing some gross stuff. We're going to be discussing the opposition, people who are confused and have misunderstandings about trans people, and this is going to include some inaccurate or prejudiced views of trans people. We're not going to dwell on those, but they are going to come up, and it's something that we sometimes need to directly discuss to be able to engage in this work. So, the Trans Organizing and Narrative Shift, or TONS project. What the heck is that? Well, a number of years ago, a trans woman who works at the Equality Federation, Viv Toppings, who is still the sort of captain of this ship, identified, along with lots of other trans people and advocates, that there were gaps between the messaging tools we had and the ways those actually worked in our values in the real world. And so I'll give an example, which is a couple of years ago, there was a fight against an anti-drag bill. There was a bill being proposed in one of the mountain states to make drag performance restricted to people 18 and up and have all sorts of bad ramifications. And some of the research from some of the national LGBT orgs showed that people were really uncomfortable with drag performers, people meaning voters, people who are not part of the LGBT community. And so the recommendation that this organization gave was that drag performers shouldn't be featured front and center in these campaigns. The data, the research was really important. Drag performers make people uncomfortable. But the conclusions from that data didn't really align with the values of uplifting the people in the community. So Viv at the Equality Federation, along with many other people, really came to what would it look like to have trans leadership, deeply invested in trans storytelling, and backed by trans community? What would it mean to have a advocacy campaign with those values behind it? And ultimately, what came out of that is TONS, is the Trans Organizing and Narrative Shift Project. And what that looks like in practice is deep canvassing, meaning longer 20, 30-minute conversations with people at the door and on the phone. That goes back and forth with message research, which might be online surveys, might be phone banking, might be dial testing where people watch a video and turn a dial to say how they're feeling about it at the time. All of which is fed into an advisory council of actual trans people who are doing advocacy work in all parts of the country, in all different issue areas and experiences. All of that feeding into organizing trans people and allies to create a narrative shift. And so it's every single part of that has been done before by other organizations. I don't want to pretend that all of this is brilliant and new, but what is, as far as I'm aware, new is all of these different pieces coming together. So it's not just those long conversations, those deep canvassing conversations at the door and on the phone. It's not just an advisory council of trans people who are being listened to and taken seriously. It's not just message research online and in depth. It's all of those things together feeding into the organization, the Equality Federation, that has the resources to then push narrative shift and organizing power. So, what have we learned and what can we do with it? Couple of big picture learnings. There's no one message or messenger that works for everyone. If there was ever a moment where we were going to have one 60-second Super Bowl ad that solved everything, we missed it. I don't think there ever was such a moment, but if there was, we missed it. And so, frustratingly and differently than some stuff you may have participated in before, I'm not going to give specific talking points. I know they're useful and there are some great ones out there, but this is about how to approach those conversations rather than the specific script you might want to use. And then more broadly, that trans people come in all backgrounds, shapes, sizes, colors, experiences. Likewise, the people who we want to reach come in all of those backgrounds. And so the phrasing we use, which I've loved, is a tapestry of diverse messengers. So it's not just any one type of person. And that includes allies as well as trans folks. And so in this research, we've used tons and tons of different video messengers, including Richard is my dad. There's some other people on there who are trans. There are other allies on there. And this is just a small selection because we know that no one of them is going to reach everyone and that no audience is going to be reachable by everyone. And so everyone on this call has people they can reach. And everyone on this call has people that they can say, hey, this is not the person for me, or this is not the scenario or the environment for me. We also learned that many people have what are called flawed mental templates about transgender people. This is pretty intuitive, but the research backs it up. And that if we want to change those hearts and minds, we need to engage in a way that doesn't make people feel defensive. This is, and there's not really another way to put it, this is unfair. It is unfair to ask trans folks and allies to engage with people who have misunderstandings about us. And yet, if we don't, we're really ceding that to the opposition. And so it's this dual truth of we need to engage without making people feel defensive. And it's totally understandable if you now or at some point in the future say, that is not what I can do. And so I'm going to find a different way to engage in this work. In particular, this is why it's actually harder to do this with people you know. And that doing this with people you don't know, knocking at the door or calling people on the phone, can in some ways be easier because you don't have that history. And it is sometimes we're more defensive with the people we have those close relationships with. And then conversations and storytelling are more effective than messages alone. And this is something that we're going to talk about. If we don't prime the soil by building an emotional connection, the facts and figures aren't going to matter. This is something that is very frustrating. As someone who loves facts and figures, I want to be able to say, here's the percentages, here's the research, here's the data. And that for most people, myself included, that just doesn't do it. We need an emotional connection. We need to trust the person we're talking with or listening to before we get there. And that's why we need to be able to listen non-defensively. It doesn't mean we need to agree. It doesn't mean we need to validate. But that if someone says something offensive to me, if I say, well, that's bullshit, they're less likely to actually listen. But if I'm able to say, I'm not sure I agree with that, but I want to make sure I'm understanding you, there's maybe more room there. This is also why it's important to have that diversity of messengers and diversity of stories. Because when people hear stories, ask questions, they're more open to reconsidering and they're more open to thinking about it later. We're trying to plant those seeds. And that surprisingly, even in this environment, people are open for persuasion. And there's a couple of reasons for that, we think. Some of it is that they're hearing about this and they don't have anywhere to talk about it. whether they're hearing about it from their kids who say they have trans classmates and isn't that great, or whether they're hearing about it from Fox News saying something awful. They're hearing about it in the news, and they're probably not able to talk about it with their coworkers. They're probably not able to talk about it with their friends. And so being able to talk about it is really valuable, even when in places or with people we might not think immediately. And when we approach that with curiosity rather than judgment, there's some really cool movement that can happen. And I want to show you from our research team from Goodwin Simon Strategic Research. I love this idea of we don't need to move people the whole way. And so if we have someone who's at, let's say, avoidance, they're uncomfortable with trans identity. They don't love it. They're a little nervous about it, but we're not going to get them to engagement tomorrow. We're not going to get them door knocking tomorrow, but we might get them from avoidance to tolerance, or we might get them from tolerance to acceptance. And that can be huge in and of itself. And so we're thinking about these long-term changes of how do we not get people 10 steps down, but how do we get them 1 or 2 steps? I want to show a little bit about how we've been thinking about those populations before we get into some more concrete stuff. So we can see we have this spectrum from our hardcore opponents, or people who might be on board with the LGB but not the T, all the way to what we've called our untapped ambassadors, people who are already super duper on board but might need more skills or tools to get out there and help persuade hearts and minds, as well as the cautious progressives, people who are on board, who really like all of these ideas in theory, but just are nervous about making people uncomfortable. And everywhere in between, potentially open traditionalists who might know gay people, might even know trans people, and who are uncomfortable by that opposition, anger and hatred, but also have a lot of questions, have a lot of concerns. Reluctant supporters who similarly might know some gay people and trans people, but don't like how much things have changed in the last number of years. And then there's this really obnoxious disengaged fence sitters. And these are people who don't totally seem to care one way or another. They don't have a huge investment in it. And so we can build those emotional connections and get with them as well. But across all of here, we're not going to make our hardcore components into untapped ambassadors overnight. And then when our audiences receive effective messaging from people they can trust, it shifts how they think. And when I say that, I mean every one of these segments was able to show some amount of movement. Now, again, I still think those hardcore opponents are not worth our time, because moving 1 or 2% of them is just not worth the return. But it does show that there is movement possible everywhere. And I'm going to give a specific example from our research. But when we do this, when we listen to stories, when we have curiosity about why people think the way they do, when we show respect to them as individuals and respect to listening to their viewpoints, even if we don't agree with their viewpoints, we can help calm our audiences, calm their concerns, and understand that what we're asking of them isn't that scary, isn't as big as they might think it is, and certainly is not what they're hearing from the opposition. And so to give a little piece of the research, and we're going to share a lot more of this later. I'm trying to be careful because it's a lot of research. But to give one specific piece, one of the questions that we ask is, do you think someone can really be transgender? Like a boy being born in a girl's body or a girl born in a boy's body. Now, again, that's an obnoxious way to phrase that question. And that's not really the way we talk about trans identity within the trans community. But that's where people are. People are at a point where they're hearing about, can a boy really be a girl or a girl really be a boy? And so we're using phrasing that matches that. And what we saw is before the messaging, a little less than half of the people we spoke with thought that. And after the messaging, we moved by 14 points. Every single one of those areas had movement. Now, it was bigger movement in, say, the reluctant supporters and cautious progressives because they had more room to move. If you have 95% of people agreeing with you already, there's not a ton of room to move. And if you have 3% of people agreeing with you, you're not likely to win a ton of them over. But every single one of those areas had movement when there were these conversations, when there was listening, when there was respect and curiosity. So let's see what that looks like in practice. And then we'll get into some conversation and some Q&A. So the big four things that we have discovered, or again, I don't want to say discovered because other people have been doing this, but we've confirmed. One is we want to disrupt those flawed mental templates. What do I mean by that? We first want to ask about what they think. We want to make sure we understand where they are to begin with. And then we want to have that diversity. We want to talk about different types of trans people, different trans experiences. We want to explain why we're doing this. This is for me as a trans person, or for my friend as a trans person, or because I have faith beliefs that align with this, or because whatever your personal connection is. And that trans people are part of those communities and part of families and workplaces and jobs and elected officials and all of these other things. So we're going from the misunderstanding, that flawed mental template, to what is the more authentic and diverse and nuanced idea of what it can mean to be trans. Many people in our audiences assume that trans people are seeking attention, are pushing an agenda. And so we can get into the sort of live and let live. Trans people, like everyone else, are trying to live our lives. Similarly, audiences sometimes have a hard time imagining trans people as part of family, as part of community, as part of workplaces. So to be able to say that trans people are part of our communities, part of our families, part of our workplaces, everyday members of society. So that's number one. Number two is creating new emotional reactions. And so this can be shared values. We want to protect kids in schools. We all want to protect kids in schools. This can be having empathy for, yeah, I get it. It would be a lot simpler if the world was boys over here and girls over here and that was it. Yeah, that would be a much simpler world to live in. That's not the world we live in. And so we can have empathy for that, even if we're not agreeing with it. Similarly, we can say, yeah, remember, I'm in my 40s. Remember growing up, there was language about talking about gay people. There were TV shows that had jokes about gay people. That might not be okay now because we've learned that more people are gay and we've learned that it's not a choice and we've learned that it's okay for gay people to be part of our communities and that they already were and are part of our communities. And we can normalize that being unfamiliar is common. This was not something I learned about in school. I joke that my parents did not have expect a trans kid in What to Expect When You're Expecting, that I can have grace and space is a term we use a lot. I can have grace and space without validating or agreeing with someone's misunderstanding. Similarly, I can acknowledge the fears people have. Oh, yeah, it sounds like you're really worried about people being pushed into being trans or kids being persuaded. I can acknowledge that without agreeing with it. And similarly, I can say, it sounds like you're really worried about kids without validating that specific fear. Again, we're trying to get that new emotional reaction in a way that doesn't get defensive and doesn't cause people to put up those roadblocks. And that we know people have concerns, particularly about bathrooms, about sports, about safety, and we can talk about all of those. And in particular, again, that curiosity, ask, what's the thing you really fear is going to happen? And then talk through, does that seem realistic? And for the most part, those extreme fears are just not realistic. And then we're filling those knowledge gaps. So if it's not realistic for an NFL player to just walk onto the children's girls soccer team, what is realistic? And so we're filling those both from our own personal experiences and from experts. Well, what I've learned is, here's a video I can send you, or here's a video I can show you. And what we are filling knowledge as well of what it's actually like to be transgender. This is a balance to strike because we've leaned into sometimes the negatives we've leaned into the suicidal ideation, or we've leaned into discrimination, or we've leaned into violence. And all of those things have their place. And we want to remind people that when trans kids are supported, they can thrive in school. When trans adults are supported, they can thrive in their communities. When trans people are supported, we can thrive alongside everyone else. And so we're trying to balance that. Showing negative outcomes can be important. And a lot of people think that being trans destines you to a negative life because of those negative outcomes. And so we want to find that balance of, and some of the most effective messengers we've used can talk with humor, can talk with joy, can talk about the way that, and I'll use myself as an example, transitioning has allowed me to be closer with my parents because it's allowed me to be authentic and more authentic in those relationships. So both with my mom, who I will out as being on this call right now. I see her name in the attendees, as well as my dad, who I said was one of those messengers in those videos. My being open with them about who I am has allowed me to have a deeper relationship with them. And being able to paint those positive things is really important too. Again, not saying all trans people are going to have happy outcomes, but also not saying that all trans people are going to have unhappy outcomes either. And depending on who our audience is, depends on what those facts might be, whether it's particularly about young people or about sports or about bathrooms or whatever it is. In particular, a lot of people use the desire to protect children as justification for anti-trans beliefs or policies. And so we want to be careful to validate and uplift. Yeah, that part of protecting children is something we can all agree on. So agreeing with the instinct there while talking through, is this really the best way to put it? And to just acknowledge that different people have different levels of knowledge can be really helpful there. So again, we're talking about disrupting those flawed templates, building that new emotional reaction, filling those knowledge gaps, and then last but not least, paint what the future could look like, both of harm and of positive possibility. So we're being honest about those challenges. We aren't necessarily saying everything is political. Even if it is, this is something that is frustrating, particularly for those of us who work with C3 organizations, because we aren't always able to acknowledge that there is a marked difference between the two major parties of how they approach these issues. And yet, conceivably, these are hopefully, ideally, not red issues or blue issues. And so we're trying to not overly politicize, even if we're talking about the honest thing. And then leaving people with those ideas of both what positive things could look like, as well as how anti-trans policies can be harmful, and how we connect those dots between harm and hope. And when we're doing this, going back to, we have this deep canvassing, that door knocking, those long conversations, that's feeding back and forth with that message research, phone banking and online surveys and long-term conversations and in-depth interviews. That's all coming back with the Trans Advisory Council, with trans experts and advocates who can say, hey, we're missing something here. So to give an example, without the Trans Advisory Council, we would not have done as much outreach to Indigenous and Native populations, because that was a gap that they said, hey, Native and Indigenous populations are not necessarily thinking about trans identity the same way. And so the same language probably isn't going to reach them. And then all of that is going back into the Equality Federation and back into this organizing push to both organize trans folks and shift that narrative. So what does this mean that you can do? And I'm going to leave with a couple things before we then get into that conversation and Q&A. So the first big one is, I would encourage you, and I love seeing the number of people on the chat already who are with organizations, that this is really hard stuff to do alone. Some of that is going back to that emotional reason, that if I'm trying to talk about these issues with my coworkers or my parents or friends who I already know, There's going to be a deeper emotional connection, which can have some benefit, but it also means that I'm more likely to get emotional myself than if I'm talking with a stranger. And organizing, connecting with a group or with a team or with a nonprofit or with just a group of friends is going to make it easier to do that work. It's going to make it easier to prepare and practice that work. It's going to make it easier to conduct that work. And it's going to make it possible to collect the data to say, is this working? Have we reached the right people? Are we knocking on the right doors? So you're finding that organizing, whether it's with friends or with a nonprofit or with a political party. And then the three things that we're really thinking about is preparing that soil. And that means making that emotional connection. That if we lead with facts, which I want to do all the time, I always want to lead with facts. But if we lead with facts, we're just not going to reach people. We need to make that emotional connection first. Then we can plant those seeds. We can ask the questions, what are you concerned about? And we can plant those seeds. Interesting. What I've heard is, or in my experience that, or, well, the data I have to show you says, and then over time, with organizing, with those emotional connections, with the seeds we've planted, we're growing that garden. We're doing organized narrative shift. We're creating social change. We're creating policy change, and we're creating that victory. And again, I'm going to find that slide again. We are moving everyone. The most important groups to move from a strategic standpoint, thinking about voting, thinking about elections, thinking about policy change, are those middle groups. That's where we have the most room to move people. And then on the green end, the right end, that's where we have people who are already with us who we can activate, people who are on this call, perhaps. But that when we're thinking about having that long-term campaign of building those emotional connections, of correcting those misunderstandings, planting those seeds, and then over time growing those gardens, we really do have the ability to create change in a way that can sometimes feel impossible. And I'll give one anecdote before I stop talking and we get into some conversation. I was fortunate enough to be able to go down to Missouri. Missouri has a really rough ballot measure this year where connected, they are trying to undo abortion protections that were passed a couple years ago and block gender affirming care for trans youth. And so in one ballot measure, they're saying we're going to undo abortion protections and make it harder for trans youth to access care. And what we are seeing is that many, many people at first will say, well, I like the abortion protections. I don't like undoing that part. But I'm really skeptical about trans youth and accessing care. And that having conversations, why? What are you hearing? Do you know any trans people in your own life? Can I share my own experiences over the course of not even days or weeks, but 20 or 30 minutes? So enough for a real conversation. People are changing their minds. People are going from, I'm really concerned to, I still have questions, but I'm not going to vote to block it. And if we go back to that spectrum, that's what we need. We don't necessarily need everyone to be on our side 100% tomorrow. We need people to care enough and to have enough nuance and question that they can say, I might not know everything, but I know enough that banning this care is wrong. I know enough that banning trans kids from sports is wrong. I know enough that banning trans healthcare is wrong. And that's where we can then continue to build and grow those relationships so that over time we'll have the social change and the victory we need. That has been a very quick overview of a very complicated project with a lot of moving pieces. After this, we are going to be able to share with you a digital version of our fancy pants new resource guide. This is 50 pages of going more in depth into all of this, including worksheets on how both trans folks and allies can construct their stories and think about their stories for this type of work, as well as how organizations, how nonprofits or community groups might construct a campaign to do this over time. But those are the sort of core things. We are building emotional connections to prepare the soil. We're planting those seeds by correcting some of the misinformation. And we're growing that garden by maintaining those relationships over time and continuing to approach people with care and grace and curiosity, even when they are coming from places that are very frustrating. All right, that's sort of the it's not a 30-second spiel, a 30-minute spiel. So let's
It was
get into
still
it.
a
Let's
very
chat.
condensed spiel for years of research, Rebecca. It was
Yes.
incredible. And that resource, we'll be sending that as a follow-up in the email that you'll get either tomorrow or the day after when the video is available. Yeah. And I have some questions. But I'm sure other people in the chat also have questions. If you have questions, please do not put them in the chat. It is very hard for us to track your questions in the chat. If you want your question actually answered, put it in the Q&A. If you can't find the Q&A, look for the little button on the your little option set of options on the bottom of the Zoom, the little more button, and you should be able to find the Q&A in there. But before that, I'm going to take host privilege and get to ask you a few questions of my own. I want to ask you just like a really basic question, first of all, because I think that people really want like concrete takeaways. I think everyone here really wants to start doing better for trans rights now. Um, what do you think is a thing that you see well-meaning people do that the tons research has really shown that they should stop doing? And what's a counterintuitive thing that they should start doing?
Yeah. The thing that I constantly have to remind myself, simply correcting people just doesn't work.
People hate being corrected.
Yeah.
They
And
really shut down. Yeah.
we can all think of cases from our own lives where even if we're not totally sure we're right, if someone just tells us we're wrong, we're going to double down. And so, as much as it is emotionally understandable and like totally, I empathize, and it is where I come from a lot of the time. If someone says something factually incorrect, asking questions first. Where did you hear that? What do you think of that? How does that align with your own experiences? And that's a little formal and scripted what I just did, but like asking some more questions first to try and get more information,
I
almost
think
always a better idea.
I think we're so like debate pilled at this point just because of that's the structure of the internet and all of the political shows and all of that what we're supposed to do is debate people until we win. And the reality is it's just not how people's minds change. Debates don't change people's mind. They might get people more riled up who already agree with you. But if you're actually trying to change some people's mind, debates make people dig in. So but I understand the impulse because we see it everywhere around us that we're supposed to just say like the best set of words and then we will win. And it's really quite the opposite. Um, so I have another question that I want to ask, and then there are questions coming in the chat that I want to get to. But as you know, because you were one of the people I texted as soon as we got the first set of information, we got some really surprising polling results earlier this year. So we did a poll on American support for sex education in schools, and we did it as a split. So which means half of the people in the poll just got asked directly about sex education in schools, and half of them got asked about sex education in schools, and it was specified that it was trans inclusive. The language is available. AJ is going to drop a link to all of this polling we're about to talk about. So if you want to see the actual questions we asked, that's available there. Um, so I expected to see very high support for sex education because we see that across the years. We see supermajority support for sex education in the US. That is what polls always show. I expected that when we asked that split, like maybe we'd be able to say a majority of people support trans inclusive sex ed, that we would have a fall off, but because the number for sex ed support is so high, that we would still have a strong number. But instead, we saw over the course of two polls, because we replicated the first one because it was so shocking, that actually telling Americans that sex ed is trans inclusive fundamentally does not change their opinions of sex ed. There are some demographics where it shifts, but overall, as a whole, the number doesn't is within margin of error. And we actually asked follow-up questions about trans-inclusive schools, welcoming schools, and also whether schools had a obligation to protect trans students from discrimination. We got super majority support for trans kids in all of those polls. Um, it's not a lot of times lately that you see great trans news, or at least you see it reported, and I wonder if that's part of the issue. And I just wonder what you've seen in the tons research that can, if there's anything that can shed light on why we got these delightful but shocking results.
Yeah. So this is a gut take. This is not a data informed take.
Yeah,
Um, but I think some of what the tons research has shown is that people are willing to have these conversations and that we record for internal training and use almost all of the conversations we have, and that many of them you will hear, oh, I can't talk, and then a 15-20 minute conversation. Or, oh, dinner is on. I can't have this conversation right now. And then a 25-minute conversation. And that there is something there that um, is not being captured by the way this conversation is shown in the public as sort of like extremes on the left or extremes on the right. That I could imagine, again, this is an emotional response, not a data informed one, that if you're already on board for sex ed or you're unsure about sex ed, the idea of having it more comprehensive could be really enticing rather than having it be less comprehensive.
I love that. I love that. I love that people want kids to learn more because it's not what you hear in the news. I'm seeing a question about the poll that I'm going to answer now, and then we're going to get to other questions. Where did we conduct the polls? We hired two different pollsters. The first pollster was Voss Strategies, Jonathan Voss, who's an incredible pollster. And then because we got this shocking result in the Voss poll, actually telling respondents that it was trans inclusive, increased support for sex ed. And then we replicated, that was in January, and we replicated those polls in April with YouGov, and we got fundamentally the same response within margin of error. It was a little lower than if you didn't mention it was trans inclusive, but it was within margin of error. So those are both national polls, and if you, AJ can drop the link again, but you can read all about that polling at that link if you're interested in more info about the poll. But it is a real result. We did it twice to make sure.
And I will say for the um, polls that I mentioned and that I shared some screenshots of from the tons research, that was done by Goodwin Simon Strategic Research, GSSR, and that was a national poll, a national representative poll that did oversampling in different racial demographics to make sure that we had
Yeah,
representative samples of different demographics.
great. Uh, is there data that this approach sticks with people given that this approach sticks with people given the onslaught of anti-trans rhetoric? So we're having these conversations with people. Is the conversion gonna stay even though they're still experiencing new propaganda and hate every day?
So there absolutely is data that deep canvassing, which is again these longer conversations that happen either at the door or on the phone, has lasting impact. Deep canvassing comes out of the marriage equality fight and following the Prop 8 loss in California, which I imagine some people on this call are familiar with, and some people on this call were not yet politically aware when that was going on. So after this big marriage equality loss in California, there was tons and tons of research and conversations about where that loss came from. And from that came this structure of deep canvassing, where you're having more emotionally vulnerable and long conversations with people. And for marriage equality and for reproductive rights and for immigration, and I think for a couple of other issue areas, there has been research showing that having these conversations and coming back 3 or 6 or 9 months later, they stick really well. For trans rights specifically, we're still doing that research over time. So, for example, that campaign I mentioned in Missouri has not been going on long enough to be able to return to people to confirm. but there's no reason that it wouldn't translate because, again, what we're trying to do is plant those seeds that grow roots so
Yeah.
that people are able to have not just the surface level, what's the latest fact I heard, but that deeper emotional level. I really remember having that conversation at the door with Rebecca, and here's what I learned from that. So it's not a guarantee, but there is really strong indicators that it is effective.
Can I add something about why deep canvassing works? And I should say, somebody in the chat mentioned Yes on Three in Massachusetts earlier, and Rebecca actually converted me to being a deep canvassing nerd for that campaign. Rebecca was like, "I'm coming to town to go canvassing, and do you want to come?" And I was like, "Sure." And it was deep canvassing, and which I had never done before, and I was like, "What are we doing? Uh, we're asking people to tell us their deepest fears after we knock on their door on a Saturday." Who's going to even talk to us? But people really, a lot of people feel like there's no space to work out how they feel because conversation gets so polarized. A lot of people really welcome the opportunity to have these conversations with someone who's being non-judgmental with them, which is why all that difficult, genuine curiosity, not attacking, not correcting stuff that Rebecca said is so important. And I've seen this happen in my deep canvassing experience. One of the reasons that those conversions are durable is because people convince themselves, right? Like what you're actually doing with these conversations is giving people a scaffolding where they can work out the place they're hung up. And they can like hear themselves say something that contradicts their own values or something like that. I've watched people just like have a penny drop, and I didn't say, "Oh, see, I gotcha," right? Like it's like them being like, "Oh, I just heard that," right? Like you can watch that shift happen in these conversations. And the reason these persuasion conversations, these conversions are durable is because people are doing deep emotional processing. We have a deep canvassing script that is very related to the TONS stuff and was sort of developed in tandem with the TONS research for trans inclusive sex education. And we did a whole talk about this as a No Means No last April, I want to say. AJ is going to drop that link in the chat for people who want to learn more about deep canvassing. And there's a question in here also about talking points in other webinars. Rebecca actually did a great No Means No event for us last fall called, I think, How to Talk About Trans Rights So That People Can Hear. And
I need to step away for 1 second. I'll be right back.
yeah, great. So, if you want more specific talking points, I highly recommend checking out that video, and AJ is going to drop that link as well. Yeah, so we're gonna wait for Rebecca to come back, but I really want to say, like, the deep canvassing stuff is so powerful, but it is, as Rebecca said, much easier to do with strangers for the simple fact that it's very hard to be non-judgmental with people you know, right? Like, so if somebody on a door you knocked on says something messed up about trans people, it's much easier to be like, huh, that's interesting that you think that way. When it's your mom, it's much harder to not be reactive. So that's a great reason to be joining organizations, joining campaigns, or putting them together. And I will say, we have several projects in the works with Deep Canvassing at Educate Us for trans inclusive sex education that we're going to be working on this year. So if you're at this event, you're on our email list. And if you want to learn about those opportunities and get involved, just stay on our email list. They will be coming down the pike. But let's get a few more questions in. How do we do this with Congress? Given that they're now largely representing constituents invented by consulting firms instead of actual humans, right? So persuading people, how does that actually work with the current political structure that we live in?
Yeah. So some of that, the same structure and conversations can apply if you're able to have a meeting with an elected official or with a staff member. And if that elected official or staff member is not, going back to thinking about that spectrum, is not 1,000% opposed. To some extent, those conversations and those, it's not going to be deep canvassing exactly the same way, but that type of curiosity and non-judgmental reflection
Can I
can be
jump in here about
valuable.
that? We've
Please.
taught deep canvassing techniques. It's not, like you said, it's not a full deep canvassing conversation, but we've taught deep canvassing techniques before a Hill Day where people were meeting with their members of Congress about sex education. And we had success with people uh, persuading their moderate Republican, and this was like 5 years ago, so things are more polarized now, but persuading their member of Congress who you might not thought of to sponsor a sex ed bill. Because do you know what happens when you ask a member of Congress to reflect on their own beliefs and like you get curious about what they believe? It is so surprising to them. It really flips the script because all day long, when they take these constituent meetings, they're just having people being like, you need to do this and let me tell you a sob story about why, right? But when you get curious about them, it catches them completely off guard. So members of Congress are people too.
And I would say,
Yeah.
in the short term, particularly given how divided many political bodies are right now in the United States, not voting for bad things can be almost as important as actively voting for good things. And so sometimes if you can cause them to question enough that they're not going to push for it, it being whatever the bad policy is, that can give broader space so that in the short term, the bad thing isn't happening. And in the longer term, there's room to try and grow more active, positive support.
Yeah. So those members of Congress also exist on that spectrum of like hard opposed to hard support, and moving them one or two notches in the right direction is, let's say, harm reduction. Yeah. Are there insights from the work that can be applied to trainings or spaces where you're speaking with more than one person at a time? So we're doing a lot of talking about how to have a one-on-one persuasion conversation around trans issues. What about when you have a room full of school board members or any other group that you're speaking to?
Yeah. I think if you're able to get, you're obviously not going to be able to have that super long conversation, but if you're able to even get one or two follow ups to try and get a little deeper. But beyond that, I do think um, sometimes we'll talk about shared values. So particularly for something like a school board, the classic, we all want to protect kids. And so reminding that there is a level of being on the same team here, even if the specific issue can feel like there is that opposition, but that idea, every student has the right to be safe and supported in school. And we do disagree about what safe and supported means, but hopefully we can at least agree in the abstract that we're all trying to go in the same direction.
The other thing that I would add to that, and I'd be curious what you think, is sort of piercing pluralistic ignorance and sort of providing social proof that supporting trans rights is a majority opinion. So I mean that's one of the reasons I think our polling is really important, if I may toot my own horn, is like most people think of sex ed and especially trans inclusive sex ed as a controversial issue. Our polling shows it is just not. Not in any geographic breakdown, not even, in most sub-demographics. It's just not a controversial issue. And uh, people, when they think, so Jonathan Voss, who did our original set of polling, told me that they do a poll every year around the Super Bowl. And when you poll people before the Super Bowl about what team they're rooting for, it's about 50-50. It's roughly 50-50. And when you poll people after the Super Bowl about what team they were rooting for, it's like 80-20 for the winning team. People want to be in the winning position. They want to have the winning opinion. And so genuinely, if you tell people that more Americans support this than they might think, and this is actually a majority opinion. Again, this is sharing a fact. You have to make that emotional connection first. But I do think that social proof really matters here because our opposition has done an incredible job at painting this as a position that, like, as a minority position to support trans rights in general. And it's just not. It's not. It's not.
And similarly, on the other side of that coin, to again, got to build that emotional connection in a vacuum. this is not a useful fact. But the reality is that there just aren't that many friggin' trans people. That some of these bills are talking about like one trans athlete in middle school. And
Yeah.
so if you're able to there's some really interesting surveys about what people think a population is versus how many people actually are part of that population. And people
Also
think that
about
there are like,
Jewish people.
yes,
I just saw these
yes.
numbers. Yes.
People think there are way more trans people than there actually are. People think there are way more Jews than there actually are. People think that like 20% of the country lives in New York City, which is baffling. Like there's all sorts of things that people think that are just
Yeah.
numbers are hard. Um, and so if you're able to help people understand that while this is really important, it shouldn't be a huge number of people that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And both of those things being true at once can
Like,
sometimes help
what if we
turn
could
down
all
the
just take a deep
temperature.
breath? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's a pretty big question, and we have almost no time to answer it. Do you want to try and give a very succinct answer to this question? If so, I will.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so this is our last question, and then I will have some closing thoughts. Um, if this isn't controversial, then who the hell is benefiting for perpetuating the lies and violence, Rebecca?
Yeah. I mean, the unhelpful question or the unhelpful answer is assholes, but that's not really, that's just restating the question. Um, some of it is, I don't want to say distraction because I think that that can um, downplay the real harm that is happening to trans people. But I do think it can be to pull focus. So for the Missouri ballot measure is a perfect example of they are trying to tie together and they're hoping that people dislike trans people more than they like abortion protections.
It's
And
divide and conquer, right?
yeah,
Like the fascist project, the authoritarian project always needs an other, and because trans people are so small, such a small group, it's actually a very good other because there aren't a lot of trans people to stand up and say fuck you, right? Like the number in numbers, but also the authoritarian project requires control over sex and gender and reproduction, which is why also why there's a ballot measure attacking abortion and trans rights at the same time, because uh they're trying to create a white race fundamentally. I mean, I don't know how to say it more succinctly
so
than that. Yeah.
something that I didn't get to include, but that I'll share. So the Goodwin Simon Strategic Research did a ton of data crunching, and the single biggest predictor of someone holding across the board super duper anti trans views was belief that the United States was founded as a Christian country and should be a Christian country today. The single biggest correlation is not causation, but that the most likely overlap of trans people don't exist was the United States is a Christian nation and was founded
And
as
I
a
just
Christian
want to say for the
country.
record, that's just false. Like the founders intentionally did not create a Christian nation. I just want to say it out loud because as much as we're not persuading people with facts, I also I find it sanity provoking to say things that are true out loud when I hear false things. Rebecca, I cannot thank you enough for coming. Come back anytime. We always love learning from you. Everybody else, also, thank you for carving out time to learn together and to do better together. Again, these events are always free, but they are not free to produce. If you got something out of it, AJ's going to drop the donation link. If you can kick us $5 or $10, it makes a huge difference. But even more so, we hope to be organizing and advocating with you. And if we can help you figure out how to do that, my email is jfriedman@jacquelinefriedman.com, and you will get an email from me in a couple days with a bunch of follow-up information. And you can just hit reply to that, and we'd love to talk to you. So have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much. We're gonna win. We really are. I don't know how long it's gonna take, but we're gonna win. Have a
Thank you
good
all
night.
for being here.